It had been years since Emma had stepped foot in the old school she once walked through every day, but as she stood there in front of the worn-out gates, something stirred within her. A flood of memories came rushing back, memories of a time when she was just a girl, full of dreams, ambitions, and a heart that cared more for the little things than the big problems that awaited her in adulthood. She had heard it all: you'll never be the same, the past is behind you, you'll change, and so will everything around you. But as Emma stood there, staring at those gates, those words felt hollow. She had changed, yes, but was this place, this school, still the same? Was there anything left of the Emma she used to be? Now, she wasn't just another student, she was a grown woman, someone who had lived through life's highs and lows. But as she took a deep breath and pushed open the gates, she could already feel the tug of something familiar. It was almost as if the school itself was whispering her name, reminding her of the days she had left behind. There were no more classes, no more lunchroom gossip, no more rushing to the bus in the morning. But one thing, one very important thing, had remained the same: the janitor. You see, every school has that one person who quietly holds it all together, the janitor, the custodian, the unsung hero who is always there, but often overlooked. They sweep the halls, clean the messes, and yet, their presence is often forgotten as the world moves on. But for Emma, this janitor wasn't just a background figure. He was someone who had left an imprint on her life without even realizing it. It wasn't just about the way he swept the floors or kept the school spotless, it was the small moments, the little things he did that made a big difference. But now, Emma was back. She had returned to the place she had once called home, the place where she had experienced the best and the worst of her teenage years. And what she didn't expect, what she never could have predicted, was that the janitor would remember her. After all these years, after all the changes, he remembered her. But the question remained: why? As Emma made her way through the old hallways, now quiet and empty, she couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity mixed with nervousness. The walls seemed to whisper the echoes of her teenage self, reminding her of the person she had been. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in her, but in the school itself. The once vibrant corridors now seemed darker, the classrooms colder. As she rounded a corner, she spotted him, the janitor. His appearance hadn't changed much. A little older, a little grayer, but there was something in his eyes, a recognition, a knowing that made Emma stop in her tracks. He was standing by the old broom closet, just like he had all those years ago. And when he saw her, a faint smile crossed his face. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying a weight of familiarity, "I never thought I'd see you back here." Her heart skipped a beat. How could he possibly remember her? After all this time, after all the people he must have met, why would he remember a teenage girl who had only crossed paths with him once or twice? But then, the story began to unfold. Emma remembered the small acts of kindness she had shown him back in her school days, the times when she'd offered a smile when others ignored him, when she'd helped him carry a heavy box, when she'd simply asked him how his day was going. It wasn't much, but it was something. In a world that often overlooked people like him, she had seen him. And now, all these years later, he hadn't forgotten her. The janitor's voice broke the silence, his words slow and deliberate. "You might not remember this, but I do. You were the one who made me feel like I mattered." Emma blinked, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. It wasn't just about the small gestures she had made, it was about the way they had impacted him. And as he shared his story, the story of how she had changed his life without even knowing it, Emma couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. She had come back to her old school seeking answers, seeking closure, but what she found was something much more profound. But there was more to this story. There was something Emma didn't know, something that would shake her to her core. As she listened to the janitor's story, she began to piece together the puzzle of what had happened all those years ago. And it wasn't just about the small acts of kindness, it was about a moment in time, a single decision that had changed the trajectory of both their lives. Stay with me, because what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. This wasn't just a story about a janitor and a student, it was a story about how the smallest acts of kindness can echo through the years, and how sometimes, those acts are the ones that truly define us. Are you ready to hear the rest? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Emma hadn't planned to come back. In fact, She had avoided this town like it was a wound she didn't want to reopen. Life had taken her far from those narrow streets and echoing hallways. After college, she had moved to Denver, then bounced between jobs in San Diego and Austin before finally landing in Seattle, where she had built a life that felt solid, at least on the surface. She had a job in content marketing, a circle of friends who understood her creative quirks, and a relationship with a man named Daniel that, while not perfect, had offered her a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. But deep down, beneath all the adult routines and filtered Instagram memories, there was always that lingering thought, the feeling that something had been left behind, something unresolved. And maybe that's why, when the email from the school reunion committee popped up in her inbox, she didn't delete it like she had so many before. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe, somewhere deep in her bones, she felt that it was time to confront whatever she had buried years ago. She hadn't told Daniel she was going back. In fact, she'd kept the whole trip quiet. Something about this return felt deeply personal, like it wasn't meant to be shared yet. She booked a one-way ticket, packed lightly, and left behind the noise of city life for the slow, almost haunting silence of her childhood town. The place hadn't changed much. Some storefronts were boarded up now, others were still stubbornly standing despite the years. The same diner still flashed its flickering neon sign at the corner, and the same cracked sidewalk outside her old school still tripped up the occasional careless pedestrian. But there was something off, something she couldn't quite name. It was as though the town had secrets it didn't want to let go of. The school, once filled with chatter and footsteps, now echoed like an old cathedral. The halls were mostly empty except for the occasional shuffle of teachers packing up their classrooms for summer break. Emma hadn't expected to feel so much emotion just walking those corridors again, but it was like every corner held a memory, a whisper of who she once was. And then there was the janitor, Mr. Lennox. She hadn't known his name back then. He was just the janitor, the man who fixed broken lockers and mopped up spilled chocolate milk without a word. Now, hearing him say her name, seeing that glint of memory in his eyes, it was unsettling. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her question what he remembered, and why. What began as a nostalgic trip was quickly turning into something more complicated. Mr. Lennox had only hinted at a memory, something she had done, a kindness that had stayed with him. But the way he looked at her, the way his words lingered, it felt like he was holding something back. And the more she talked to him, the more she felt that this wasn't just about reminiscing, it was about uncovering something that had been deliberately buried. The janitor wasn't just recalling the past, he was pointing her toward something. Something he couldn't, or wouldn't, say outright. Emma started asking questions, quietly at first. She reached out to a few old classmates who still lived nearby, under the pretense of catching up. Most were friendly, a few were awkward, and some didn't respond at all. There was a strange hesitance in their voices when she brought up the school. One even asked her if she really wanted to dig up old ghosts. That phrase stuck with her. What ghosts? What had happened that was still haunting people nearly 15 years later? One classmate, Julia, who had been in Emma's honors history class, agreed to meet for coffee. Julia had always been sharp, the kind of student who volunteered answers even when no one else wanted to speak. Now she seemed more guarded, her eyes darting as if afraid of being overheard even in a half-empty cafe. When Emma asked about the janitor, Julia flinched. "He's still there," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I thought he left after the incident." Emma pressed for more, but Julia only shook her head. "I don't want to talk about that. Just, be careful. People remember things differently. And not everyone wants to be remembered." That was the first time Emma realized there might be more to her past than she recalled. She'd always thought of herself as a good student, someone who mostly kept to herself, got decent grades, didn't make waves. But as she dug deeper, she began to uncover small cracks in that image. A disciplinary note she didn't remember. A substitute teacher who left suddenly and never came back. A girl in her class, Shannon, who had transferred mid-year under unclear circumstances. These details didn't make sense, didn't fit the neat narrative of her high school years. And the more she looked, the more she began to feel like she had forgotten something important, something that others still remembered. And then there was the letter. Left anonymously at her old locker, now empty and rusted but somehow still bearing her faded name. The handwriting was shaky, the paper old and brittle. It read, "You came back. You shouldn't have." Just those words. No name. No explanation. But it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Someone knew she was there. Someone had been watching. And someone didn't want her to uncover the truth. What was the incident Julia referred to? Why had Mr. Lennox chosen now to speak to her, after all these years? And what exactly had Emma forgotten or been made to forget? The town, the school, even the people she once called friends, all seemed to be hiding something. The deeper she went, the more the lines between memory and mystery blurred. She was starting to feel like she was chasing a shadow that moved just out of reach. But she couldn't stop now. Not when every step brought her closer to an answer she didn't even know she needed. And not when it seemed like the past she thought she knew was beginning to unravel into something far more complex and far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Someone was lying. Someone wanted her to forget. But she was starting to remember. And just as she thought she was beginning to understand the truth, something happened that changed everything. Emma returned to the school the next morning with a growing sense of unease. The cryptic note had rattled her more than she cared to admit, but it also fueled her determination. Someone clearly didn't want her digging into the past, and that only meant there was something worth uncovering. She walked through the halls with a different kind of focus now, eyes open, ears alert, as though every creak in the floor or echo of a locker door held a clue. She found herself retracing old footsteps, stopping by her former homeroom, revisiting the library, and even peeking inside the drama classroom where she'd once performed in a school play. It all felt strangely frozen in time, like the school was trapped in its own memory. But that illusion began to crack the moment she went looking for Mr. Lennox. He wasn't where he usually was. His supply closet was locked, and the front office secretary, a woman named Carol who wore thick glasses and a tired smile, claimed he hadn't clocked in that day. When Emma asked if that was common, Carol hesitated just a second too long before saying, "He's been a little off lately. Maybe he just needed a break." But there was something behind her words, a stiffness in her voice that didn't match her smile. Emma thanked her and walked away, but the pit in her stomach grew heavier. Just yesterday, Lennox had been there, speaking to her like he had been waiting for the right time. Now he was gone, and no one seemed to want to talk about it. Later that afternoon, Emma stopped by the school's records office, hoping to get access to yearbooks, staff directories, anything that might give her a clearer picture of who had worked at the school during her time there and who had left abruptly. The assistant in charge, Mr. Diggs, a lanky man with thinning hair and a nervous laugh, was friendly at first but changed the moment she mentioned her graduating class. He told her that the archives had been moved recently and that he'd need a few days to locate them. His excuse felt rehearsed, as if someone had already told him what to say. Emma pressed further, asking about staff departures during her junior year, but he claimed not to remember much. "A lot of teachers come and go," he said, avoiding her eyes. "You'd be surprised how many just vanish without much notice." That phrase echoed in her head. Vanish without much notice. Like Mr. Lennox now. Like the substitute teacher who left suddenly. Like Shannon, the girl who transferred under a cloud of silence. It was as if these disappearances weren't just coincidences, they were part of a larger pattern, a cover-up that had been silently maintained for over a decade. That evening, Emma returned to her hotel room and found that the letter she had saved, the one that warned her not to return, was gone. She had tucked it safely into a book in her bag, certain no one had touched her things. She tore the room apart in search of it, but it was nowhere to be found. No signs of a break-in, no tampering, nothing obvious. It was simply gone, like it had never existed. Someone was watching her. Someone had gotten close enough to remove the only physical proof she had that her return was being monitored. She felt exposed, like the walls had ears and her own memories weren't safe. Later that night, she received a text from an unknown number. It read, "Some truths aren't meant to be found. You should go back to Seattle before it's too late." The message was deleted seconds after she read it, vanishing from her screen before she could react. Emma sat frozen on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, trying to understand who would go to such lengths to stop her. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore, it was about control, about keeping something buried. The next morning, a name popped into her mind, Mr. Anders, her old guidance counselor. He had always seemed kind, but distant, the kind of adult who smiled a lot but never gave straight answers. She tracked down his address from a public records search and drove to his home just outside of town. When he answered the door, he looked genuinely surprised to see her, but invited her in without hesitation. His home was cozy, filled with books and family photos, but there was a tension in the air the moment she mentioned the school. At first, he danced around her questions, offering polite, vague replies. But when she mentioned Shannon by name, something shifted in his expression. He looked away, his voice dropping. She was a bright girl, he said slowly. Too bright. Asked too many questions, just like you're doing now. Emma leaned in, asking what he meant, but he wouldn't say more. Instead, he told her something unexpected, that back in her senior year, a folder with her name on it had gone missing from his office. It had contained notes from a mandatory session she didn't even remember attending. When he reported it, he was told to drop the matter. Shortly after, he was offered early retirement. They didn't want anything traced back, he said. And if I were you, I'd stop before you find something you can't unsee. Emma left his house more confused than ever. What could be in a school counseling file that needed to be erased? What had happened during that year that was so dangerous it led to missing people, silenced teachers, and buried records? And then came the final twist. When she got back to her hotel that night, there was a note slipped under her door. It simply said, "You weren't the only one." She stared at it, heart racing, as the implications hit her. Someone else had been part of it. Someone who had also been silenced. Someone who might still be watching. The problem was, she had no idea whether that person was a friend or something far more dangerous. The note, "You weren't the only one," wouldn't leave Emma's thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the scrawled message for what felt like hours, her mind churning through every possible angle. It opened a door to something she hadn't considered before, that whatever had happened all those years ago wasn't centered on her alone. That maybe there were others who had been affected by the same chain of events, others who had been quietly silenced or erased, and someone out there still remembered and was watching. But the timing was what unsettled her most. Whoever left the note had to know where she was staying, what room she was in, and when she would be out. That kind of access wasn't random. It was deliberate. This wasn't just a ghost from the past trying to rattle her, it was a warning, and maybe even a challenge. And before she could even begin to untangle what it meant, her phone buzzed with a new message. This time, it wasn't anonymous. It was from Daniel. The text was short, but it stopped her cold. "Hey, Em. Weird question, did you send me a letter? Something about your high school?" Her stomach dropped. She hadn't told Daniel anything about what she was doing, hadn't even said which town she was in. The whole trip was supposed to be her private mission, a quiet detour into a long-forgotten part of her life. She called him immediately. When he picked up, his voice was tinged with concern. He told her a package had arrived at their apartment in Seattle that morning, addressed to her but in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside, there was a photocopy of a yearbook page, her junior year class photo, to be exact, with a single red circle around Shannon's face and the word "remember" written across it in thick, black marker. No return address. No explanation. Nothing but that one word and the image of a girl neither of them had spoken of in over a decade. Emma's blood ran cold. Someone had crossed a line. This wasn't about her memory anymore, it was about control. About pressure. About fear. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her, they were trying to show her that nowhere, not even home, was safe. Suddenly, what Emma thought she had kept isolated from her current life had bled across the lines. Daniel promised to keep the envelope in case they needed it later, but Emma could hear it in his voice, he was rattled. And deep down, she knew the moment she hung up that she had dragged him into something dangerous, something that no longer felt like a mystery to solve but a trap tightening with every new clue. She knew she had to warn him, to tell him to stay away, but part of her also knew it might already be too late. Someone was playing a game, and they were several moves ahead. The next day brought another twist, one that left Emma more shaken than any letter or warning. While visiting the town's public library, searching for archived local newspapers from her junior year, she came across an article that had been strangely misfiled under a different date. It was brief, barely noticeable, a small piece tucked away between community announcements and weather reports. But what it described changed everything. It mentioned an anonymous tip received by the school board in the spring of Emma's junior year, alleging misconduct by a staff member and suggesting a cover-up involving students who had been persuaded to stay silent. The article didn't name the staff member, and the follow-up was mysteriously absent. It was as if the incident had been wiped from public record. But what struck Emma most was the date, April 12th. That was the exact week Shannon had suddenly stopped coming to school. Emma left the library in a daze, walking the streets like she was underwater, the pieces swirling but not yet fitting together. Her instincts screamed that this went deeper than anyone was willing to admit. The warnings, the disappearances, the carefully altered memories, this wasn't just about guilt or trauma. It was about something that had been deliberately buried by people with something to lose. And she began to wonder, not for the first time, whether Mr. Lennox was really an ally or just another carefully placed part of the puzzle. He had reappeared just as she returned, said just enough to pull her in, then vanished without a trace. Had he been silenced again, or had he been part of the misdirection all along? The weight of the evidence, the shifting loyalties, and the creeping paranoia began to build in her chest. Emma felt like she was being watched, guided, and manipulated all at once. She couldn't even be sure of her own memories anymore. What if the truth she was chasing wasn't really hers at all, but something someone else had carefully constructed for her to find? And what if each new clue wasn't a step closer to clarity, but a deeper descent into something far more twisted than she imagined? And then came the final blow. That evening, back in her hotel room, she checked her email and found a message from a burner address, time-stamped only minutes before. There was no subject line, no body, just one attachment. It was a blurry, low-resolution photo of her, taken from behind as she stood in the library hours earlier, staring at the newspaper archives. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. And at the very bottom of the image, just barely visible in the shadows, was a face she hadn't seen in over 10 years. A face that was supposed to be gone. The photo vanished seconds later, the email deleted from her inbox as though it had never existed. But Emma had seen enough to know that nothing, absolutely nothing, about her past was what it seemed anymore. Emma barely slept that night. The shadowed face in the photo clung to her mind like smoke, refusing to clear. The familiarity of it was haunting, but she couldn't name it. Maybe it was distorted by the low resolution, or maybe her brain was trying to protect her from recognizing something she wasn't ready to face. Every creak of the floor outside her room, every rustle of wind against the window made her sit upright in bed, heart pounding, convinced someone was out there. She checked the locks on the door 3 times before finally pulling a chair up beneath the knob, as if that could do anything against whoever was bold enough to stalk her inside a public library. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness as she went over the photo again and again, zooming, enhancing, but the face was like a ghost, half hidden, half familiar, fully terrifying. It wasn't just the image that unnerved her. It was the fact that it was sent, then deleted, almost like a demonstration. A reminder that she wasn't in control here. Someone else was watching every move, and worse, they wanted her to know it. The next morning brought no clarity, only escalation. Emma tried to call Daniel, but his phone went straight to voicemail. That alone wasn't too strange. He worked in a high-rise office where reception was often spotty. But as the hours ticked by with no reply, no returned call, no text, a slow panic began to burn in her chest. She called again, then again, pacing the room with the phone pressed to her ear, until finally she called his office line directly. The woman who answered was polite, but confused. "I'm sorry," she said. "Daniel called in sick today. Said he was feeling under the weather." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel never called in sick. He hated staying home unless he physically couldn't stand up. Something was wrong. She knew it in her gut. The creeping dread that had been building since she returned to town suddenly erupted into full-blown fear. Someone had gotten to him. And now he was unreachable. She threw on a jacket and rushed out of the hotel, barely stopping to lock the door behind her. She needed answers, and the only person who might still have them was Mr. Lennox. If he was still alive, still hiding, still playing his cryptic role in this twisted story. She drove straight to the school, but his closet was still locked and the front office had a new excuse. "He's on leave," Carol said without looking up from her desk. "Indefinite. Health reasons." Her tone was flat, robotic, rehearsed. Emma didn't even bother pressing this time. It was clear Carol was either in on whatever was happening or had been warned to keep quiet. Either way, the door to the truth was closing fast. Outside the school, she stood in the parking lot with her hands trembling. She could feel eyes on her, whether real or imagined, it didn't matter anymore. Paranoia was no longer a distant suspicion. It was reality. She wasn't just chasing a memory, she was being hunted through it. She thought about calling the police, but what could she even say? That she got a creepy photo? That someone might be following her? That she had a bad feeling her boyfriend was in trouble across the country based on a few strange coincidences? She knew how it would sound, and worse, she feared involving the wrong person might tip her stalker off. She didn't know who to trust, and that uncertainty was eating away at her like acid. Back at the hotel, things only got worse. Her room had been cleaned, which was expected, but the maid claimed she never touched the desk. Yet her laptop, which she had left open and running, was now shut and the screen smudged like someone had used it. Her browser history had been wiped clean. Someone had gone through her files. Not stolen anything. Not destroyed anything. Just looked. Maybe copied. Maybe planted something. That feeling, the loss of personal space, the invasion of her private world, broke something in her. She sat on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands, overwhelmed not just by the threat itself, but by the intimacy of it. Whoever was behind this wasn't some distant figure lurking in the shadows. They were close. Close enough to reach into her life and rearrange things, to take without taking, to leave fingerprints on her reality without ever being seen. She knew now that this wasn't about a simple act of kindness remembered by a janitor. That had been the hook, the bait, an easy way to get her attention, to draw her back into a place where her memories could be used against her. But it was more than that. It was targeted. Deliberate. Designed. The more she thought about it, the more she began to suspect that the incident from her junior year, the one mentioned in the article, the one that no one would talk about, was only the surface of something deeper, something far more sinister. And the people involved. They weren't strangers anymore. They were people she had trusted. People she might still be trusting. That night, after dark, she left her hotel room quietly and drove out past the edge of town to an old neighborhood she hadn't visited in years. She needed air. She needed space to think. As she pulled over near a playground that had long since fallen into disrepair, her phone buzzed again. One message. No number. Just a video file. Hands shaking, she opened it. The screen flickered for a second, then showed a close-up shot of her hotel room door. It was filmed from the hallway. A knock sounded. Then, after a pause, the door creaked open. The camera zoomed in slightly as a figure slipped inside, wearing a hoodie and gloves. They didn't take anything. They simply walked to the desk, touched the laptop, looked around, and left. The clip ended with the door closing slowly. Emma dropped the phone in her lap, chest heaving. There was no question anymore. She was being watched in real time. Her life had become someone's project, someone's performance. And whoever they weren't just after the truth. They were after her. Emma didn't sleep. She sat in the dark with her back against the hotel wall, her eyes locked on the door, waiting for anything to make sense. The video had shattered whatever illusion of safety she had been clinging to. It confirmed every suspicion she had buried and amplified every fear she had tried to suppress. Someone was inside her life. Someone was orchestrating this nightmare like it was all part of a meticulously laid-out plan. And the most terrifying part? She was starting to believe that none of this was about what had happened at the school, it was about her. The school, the janitor, the missing girl, even the photos, maybe they were distractions, threads woven into something larger, something personal. But Emma had no idea what it was. She only knew that the walls were closing in, and someone was guiding her deeper into the maze. By morning, Her instincts pushed her to the only person left she could trust, or so she thought. Julia. The one classmate who had been hesitant but willing to talk. Emma met her again at a quiet trailhead outside of town, far from cameras and curious eyes. Julia looked nervous, her shoulders tense, glancing back toward her car more than once. They spoke in hushed tones, and Emma could tell immediately that Julia had something she had been holding back. When Emma brought up the article, the missing counselor records, and especially the mysterious video, Julia paled. She asked if Emma had told anyone else, and when Emma said no, not yet, Julia let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. And then, just when Emma thought she might finally get the truth, Julia dropped the kind of revelation that hit harder than anything before it. The thing you don't remember, it wasn't just about Shannon, she said, her voice barely audible. It was you. You were part of it. Emma froze. The world seemed to tilt sideways as the words hit her. She laughed at first, a dry, shocked sound, and shook her head, thinking Julia must have misunderstood. But Julia didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old envelope, the kind the school used for disciplinary reports. Inside was a photo, grainy and discolored with time, but clearly from the school hallway. It showed a younger Emma, eyes wide, standing in front of a locker. And next to her, pinned by 2 staff members, was Shannon, her face streaked with tears. Emma's hand was raised as if trying to stop something. Or maybe, to signal it. The angle was ambiguous, the moment frozen in chaos. But the look on Emma's face wasn't fear. It was confusion. Maybe even detachment. The date on the photo? April 12th. The exact day Shannon disappeared. Julia whispered, "You were brought in for questioning that day. But they buried it. I didn't see the file until a teacher who was forced into early retirement gave it to me. He said the school wiped the records. But the photo survived. Somehow." Emma's stomach turned. She had no memory of that moment. None. She tried to rationalize it, trauma, false memory, something repressed. But the evidence was there in her hands. Not only had she been present during Shannon's final day at school, but it looked like she may have been directly involved in whatever had led to Shannon being restrained and removed. Why had no one ever told her? Why had she forgotten? And then Julia said the one thing that shattered the entire narrative. It wasn't the janitor who remembered your kindness. It was Shannon. She asked for you that day. She screamed your name. Over and over. The ground beneath Emma's reality shifted. Everything she thought she was unraveling now came with new weight. This wasn't about a forgotten kindness, it was about a shared secret. A buried event that someone had gone to terrifying lengths to keep buried. And maybe, just maybe, it was never Mr. Lennox's memory that brought her back. Maybe it was Shannon. Maybe she was still out there. Or maybe someone wanted her to think that, to feel responsible, to start pulling at the wrong thread until she unraveled herself entirely. But before Emma could ask more, before she could press Julia for the full truth, a car engine roared in the distance. Julia's face dropped in terror as a black SUV pulled into the gravel lot, tires kicking up dust. She grabbed Emma's arm and hissed, "We have to go, now." But it was too late. The doors opened, and 2 men in plain clothes stepped out, looking casual, too casual. They didn't say a word, just started walking slowly toward them. Julia shoved the file into Emma's hands and turned to run, yelling, "Don't trust anyone, not even him." "Him!" Emma shouted as she turned after her, heart pounding in her chest. But Julia was already gone into the trees, vanishing as quickly as she had appeared. Emma turned back toward the SUV, hands shaking, trying to comprehend what him could mean. And then her phone buzzed again. One new message. No contact. Just a name. Daniel. She opened it, dreading what she might find, but it was only 1 sentence. And it changed everything. "You were supposed to forget." Emma stood frozen, the photo in one hand, her phone in the other, the men now only steps away. Nothing made sense anymore. But one thing was brutally clear. This was never about discovering the truth. It was about making sure she didn't. Emma drove without knowing where she was going. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently it hurt. Julia's warning echoed louder with every mile she put between herself and the black SUV, but it was that last text, "you were supposed to forget," that truly rattled her. It wasn't just a threat. It was a confirmation. Someone had manipulated her memory. Someone had deliberately erased part of her past, and for the first time in her life, Emma felt like her own mind couldn't be trusted. The deeper she went, the more everything twisted. People she trusted weren't who they seemed. Events she was sure had never happened were now staring her in the face in ink and photographs. And now, that disturbing suggestion that Daniel, the one person she thought she could still lean on, might be involved in it all. She didn't want to believe it. But that message had come under his name, through a channel only someone close to her could have accessed. She pulled off into a small roadside diner, one of those places that still had payphones in the back and smelled faintly of old coffee and pine cleaner. She found a booth in the corner, slid in with her hood up, and pulled out the file Julia had handed her. The photo was still there, along with a few loose pages, copies of counseling notes, disciplinary slips, even an attendance record with her name circled in red ink. Each document told a version of her that Emma didn't recognize. A girl who had been pulled from class multiple times for reasons no one explained. A girl who had attended intervention sessions with counselors whose names she didn't remember. A girl who had allegedly witnessed something traumatic, something significant enough to trigger what the records called a selective dissociative episode. Her breath caught in her throat as she read that line. What had she seen? What had she forgotten? She needed to talk to Daniel. Not through texts. Not filtered through paranoia. She needed to hear his voice, read the pauses, catch the tells she'd learned over the years of loving him. She stepped outside into the cold, took a breath, and dialed his number again. This time, he picked up. At first, his voice was calm, even relieved. "Emma. Thank God. Where are you?" She didn't answer his question. Her silence told him everything. The tension dropped into the conversation like a hammer. He asked again, softer now, more carefully. "You found something, didn't you?" Her voice trembled as she asked him point blank, had he known anything about what happened at the school? About her missing memories? About Shannon? There was a long pause. Then a sigh. And then came a truth so painful it felt like being thrown into ice water. "I knew you wouldn't stop if you went back," Daniel said. "That's why I didn't want you to go. Because you already did this once before. And the last time, they erased it." Emma's entire body went still. She felt her lungs lock up as her mind tried to process what he had just said. "What do you mean before?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. "You came back to that town 2 years ago," he said. "You didn't tell anyone. Not even me, at first. I thought it was just a spontaneous road trip. But when you came back, you were different. You kept saying you couldn't remember certain days. You kept having dreams about a girl screaming. I begged you to stop, Emma. And then someone showed up at our apartment. They gave me a choice." Her voice cracked as she whispered, "What choice?" "They said you were too close. That if I wanted to protect you, I had to let them help. They gave me this offer. They'd erase the trauma. The obsession. All of it. You'd forget what you found. And we'd get to move on. But I had to agree. I had to let them access your files. And I did, Emma. I did it because I thought I was protecting you." Emma leaned against the side of the building, her knees buckling. Her stomach turned with a nausea that came from betrayal. Daniel had made a choice for her, a choice that stripped her of her agency, of her truth, of her memory. He had let them into her life, into her mind. Not to save her, but to erase her past. She hung up without another word. She didn't need to hear any more. Back inside the diner, she tried to collect herself, but the file felt like it was burning a hole through her bag. She couldn't go back to the hotel, couldn't call the police, couldn't trust anyone, not even the person she once thought would be her future. Her only option now was to find out the truth on her own, no matter what it cost. But just as she stepped outside again, ready to return to the library and dig deeper into the town's archives, she found a small envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Her name written in ink that looked rushed, frantic. Inside was a single sentence: "You have 48 hours. Then we bury it again." There was no signature. No contact. Just the ultimatum. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a deadline. And now Emma had to make an impossible choice: dig up the truth and risk vanishing with it, or walk away and live with a lie so deep, it had already stolen her memory once. But this time, they'd have to fight to take it from her. You said. Emma drove like the world was on fire behind her. The deadline, 48 hours, ticked louder in her head than the engine beneath her. Every second felt like a thread unraveling, pulling her closer to a truth that no longer waited patiently in shadows. Whatever had started with a nostalgic return to her old school had now spiraled into something far more calculated, far more dangerous. This wasn't just about her memory anymore. It wasn't just about Shannon. It was about an operation designed to rewrite the past, bury the truth, and control the narrative, not for healing, but for protection. Protection of those in power. Protection of those who had something to hide. She was halfway to the county archives when her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a threat or another anonymous taunt, it was a video call request. From Carol, the school secretary. Emma hesitated for just a moment before answering, and when the woman's face appeared on the screen, pale and panicked, Emma knew immediately this wasn't a routine check-in. "I don't have long," Carol whispered, eyes darting around like she expected someone to barge in. "I made a mistake by staying quiet. But they're watching me too now. You need to know, it's not just the school. It never was." Emma barely breathed as Carol explained in a rush what had been hidden all along. A private behavioral research group, funded through a federal education grant, had been embedded in the school district over a decade ago under the guise of monitoring adolescent trauma recovery. But what they were really doing was far more invasive. They were collecting psychological data, observing behavioral patterns, running experiments without consent on kids. On Emma. On Shannon. On dozens of students like them who'd been selected for their emotional anomalies, their histories of instability, grief, or unique behavioral traits. Those students were monitored, manipulated, and when things went too far, like with Shannon, they were quietly removed, their records erased, their families paid off or silenced. Emma felt physically ill. "So we were test subjects?" she asked, her voice cracking. Carol nodded, swallowing hard. "And when they realized you were remembering, when you came back 2 years ago, they panicked. They offered Daniel a deal to protect you. But it wasn't protection. It was containment." Emma gripped the steering wheel tighter, rage and disbelief crashing into her like waves. All this time, she thought she was chasing a forgotten incident, a singular event. But it wasn't an accident. It was part of a controlled operation. One still active. Carol's voice dropped even lower. "They're not done, Emma. They've expanded. It's not just in your town anymore. The same programs now in dozens of districts under different names. All sanitized. All approved. You're not just their memory, you're their liability." Before Emma could respond, a loud crash sounded from Carol's end. The screen shook. The feed went black. Emma screamed her name, but the line was dead. Her knuckles turned white again. She was running out of time. She was running out of people. And she was finally starting to see the full shape of the beast she was up against. The experiment had never ended, it had simply gone underground, hiding in plain sight, using children like Emma and Shannon as raw material for psychological data, emotional control, and social engineering. She arrived at the archives just before closing. The clerk on duty, a man in his 60s with a fading badge that read Hal, recognized her name when she requested old school board meeting transcripts from 2010 to 2012. He glanced at her, then at the screen, and something about his expression shifted. "You're Emma, aren't you?" he asked softly. "The one from Fairhaven High." Emma froze, startled. He sighed, as if preparing himself for something painful. "I knew this day would come. Someone was gonna come back looking." Then, without another word, he led her past the desk, down a narrow hallway, and into a back room marked Restricted Records. Inside, Hal revealed shelves of redacted files, shredded meeting minutes, and heavily edited reports from a shadow board committee created under a now-defunct state program called Project Icarus. Buried in the language of psychological evaluations and educational performance metrics was the truth Emma had feared most, her name listed not once, but dozens of times. as a focus subject. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she had a rare combination of traits the program found valuable for longitudinal emotional compliance testing. Hal showed her a printed email, dated the year she graduated, between the school superintendent and a federal contractor. It discussed the necessity of intervention-level memory suppression on subject E.J. Emma. It even referenced a success rate of 78% long-term compliance post-erasure. Her entire life, her pain, her questions, it was never an accident. It was data. She staggered backward, her breath catching in her throat, fury choking her chest. She looked at Hal, begging for answers, but he only said, "They paid me to keep it buried. But I've seen enough now to know this won't stop until it's exposed." Before she could ask what he meant, there was a noise at the front of the archive, voices, footsteps, the sound of the front door locking. Hal turned pale and reached into his desk, handing her a thumb drive. "Everything I've got, take it, run. Don't go back to your hotel. And Emma, don't trust anyone who tells you they're trying to help. Especially not him." "Him?" Emma asked, but Hal didn't answer. A voice echoed down the hall, calm and familiar, Daniel's voice. Calling her name. And that was when she realized. He'd followed her. Emma didn't run. She knew now that running only tightened the snare. Every move she'd made, every place she thought she'd chosen freely, had already been mapped out in advance. They had been 10 steps ahead from the beginning, nudging, steering, testing her reactions like a lab rat bumping through a maze with no end. But she had the drive now, clutched in her hand like a live wire. Hal's documents were everything: proof of the experiments, the memory suppression, the falsified school records, and the massive network of districts where this research was still active. It was the smoking gun they couldn't afford her to have. And as Daniel's voice echoed closer from the corridor, smooth and calm like nothing had ever been wrong, Emma realized this was the moment she'd been walking toward since the first letter arrived. This wasn't just about confronting him. It was about forcing the truth into the light, no matter how ugly, no matter what it cost. The office lights flickered overhead as she stepped out into the hallway. Daniel emerged at the other end, his hands up, expression soft with concern, but his eyes, those eyes she once trusted, betrayed everything. There was no fear in them. Just control. The kind of practiced calm that didn't come from love or panic but from knowing the outcome. "Emma," he said, taking a step forward, "I didn't want it to be like this. But you were never supposed to remember. You weren't built to carry this weight." Emma held the thumb drive tight enough to cut her palm. "Then tell me the truth," she said, her voice cracking from the pressure in her throat. "Tell me what you really did to me. What they did to Shannon." Daniel stopped. The warmth dropped from his face like a mask falling. "Shannon was the failure," he said. "The one that spiraled. She wasn't supposed to resist. But when she did, the others panicked. And you saw too much. You were the variable they couldn't predict." His voice was low now, no longer trying to sound like the boyfriend who used to hold her at night. "So they erased it. Erased her. Erased the whole quarter of testing. You lived the rest of high school thinking it was normal. That's the brilliance of it." Emma backed up slowly as he moved closer, the metal cabinets on either side of her reflecting the fluorescence in harsh streaks. "You were a part of this?" she asked, struggling to breathe. "From the beginning?" Daniel didn't blink. "They chose me to be close to you after the reset. Someone you could trust. A control variable. I didn't know what you were until the day you came back from Fairhaven with a look in your eyes like the dam had cracked. I begged them not to wipe you again. Said you were stabilizing. But this time you started digging faster than they expected. You think you came here on your own, but Emma, they wanted you to. They just didn't expect Hal to flip." Her knees almost buckled from the weight of it. Her entire relationship, her recovery, the comfort she thought she had found in Daniel, it had all been another layer of the experiment. They hadn't just erased her past. They had rewritten her future. "So what now?" she whispered. "You take the drive. You wipe me again. Start over." Daniel stepped closer, slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. "That's the offer," he said. "This time it'll be permanent. You'll go back to Seattle. You'll be happy again. You'll never remember any of this. She stared at him, heart pounding. And then, slowly, she reached into her jacket pocket, not for a weapon, but for her phone. One click, and she turned the screen toward him. A live stream was already active, broadcasting on a hidden channel she had set up an hour earlier, synced to a burner account on YouTube under a trending tag for missing persons updates. His face. His words. His confession. All of it, live. The drive didn't matter anymore. The truth was already out. Daniel's expression didn't shift, but his body did, subtle, sudden tension as he processed what she'd done. You think that'll stop them? He asked. Even if you got out of here alive, do you know how long it'll take before that video is pulled? Before you're discredited, made to look unwell, unstable? They own the narrative. They are the narrative. I don't need forever, Emma said, stepping back toward the fire exit, her voice rising with defiance. I just need one person to see it. One reporter. One whistleblower. One parent who starts asking the right questions. You built this system on silence. It only takes one scream to tear it down. A loud bang echoed from deeper in the building, doors slamming, feet pounding, other agents arriving. Daniel's voice hardened. They're already here. You have one shot. Give me the drive and I can get you out. You don't need to go down with this. She looked at him, heartbroken in ways she hadn't thought possible, not just from the betrayal, but from the years she'd spent loving a ghost, a lie, a handler who knew every word she wanted to hear. And then, without another word, she turned and ran. She didn't go back to her car. She didn't follow any planned route. She vanished into the woods behind the archive, crossing ditches, crawling under fences, navigating back roads she'd walked as a kid. By the time she reached the gas station on the other side of town, the live stream had ended, but the comments were already flooding in. People had seen it. People were asking. Not many, but enough. She dropped the drive into a prepaid envelope, addressed to a journalist known for exposing government corruption. Then she turned off her phone, tossed the SM card, and disappeared into the night, a fugitive from a version of her life she never asked for. But just as she boarded a bus heading west, she felt something odd in her coat pocket, something that hadn't been there before. A folded slip of paper, creased and yellowed. The road stretched endlessly before her, a blurred ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through remote hills where signal towers didn't reach and no one asked questions at rest stops. Emma kept her head down, hood up, her mind caught in a strange, quiet storm as the bus hummed westward. It had been weeks since the live stream, weeks of silence, shadows, and paranoia. Every headline about government surveillance or education reform made her flinch. Every time she walked past a payphone or saw a flyer about a missing child, her stomach turned. But no one had come for her yet. No black vans. No more messages. No more Daniel. The quiet was unsettling in its own way, like the moment before an earthquake finally hits. Yet somehow, through all of it, Emma felt a new kind of clarity. The weight of knowing the truth didn't crush her, it grounded her. She no longer lived in the illusion. The world had always been broken beneath the surface. Now, at least, she could see the cracks. She had sent copies of the drive to more than one place. An investigative podcast picked it up first, one of those viral true crime channels that people binge on YouTube, hungry for hidden truths and conspiracy exposés. Then came a data leak forum, followed by a Reddit thread that blew up overnight under keywords like erased memories in school, Project Icarus whistleblower, and students used as test subjects. There were skeptics, of course. Some called it a hoax. Others claimed the video was AI-generated, manipulated, staged for clicks. But there were also parents who recognized details, phrases, protocols, familiar names buried in the redacted documents. Slowly, it began to snowball. Quietly. Carefully. Like a virus spreading in the corners of the internet, infecting curiosity where it couldn't yet be quarantined. Emma had found temporary work under a different name in a small town just over the state line, bussing tables at a diner where no one cared who she used to be. She rented a room above a garage from an old couple who didn't ask questions and cooked more than they charged. Some nights she'd sit on the roof under the stars, trying to piece together who she was now, not the subject from a government file, not the girl whose memories were surgically suppressed, but a woman who had clawed her way back from oblivion. She'd never go back to who she was before. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the real her was finally emerging, scarred but real. Whole, not because of what was taken from her, but because of what she chose to keep. And then, one morning, a package arrived in the mail. No return address. Just a name, written in the same messy scrawl she'd seen once before. Shannon. Inside was a flash drive and a postcard from a place Emma didn't recognize, somewhere coastal, with cliffs and wildflowers and weather-worn cottages. The note was short. I saw what you did. I'm safe. Thank you for not forgetting me even when they made you try. It's not over. But you gave people a reason to look again. I'll find you when it's time. Emma sat with the card in her lap for a long time. The sun streamed through the window beside her, lighting the words until they shimmered. That was the thing about memory, it wasn't just about what you could recall. It was about what you chose to hold on to when everything else tried to make you let go. She hadn't saved the world. The system hadn't collapsed. But she had cracked it. She had made people ask. She had made people see. And somewhere out there, Shannon was alive, not just surviving but living beyond the reach of those who tried to erase her. The final twist wasn't that Emma uncovered the conspiracy. It wasn't even that she exposed it. The twist was that she survived it and in doing so, planted a truth too dangerous to kill, too real to silence. And now, she carried that truth forward, not as a burden, but as a quiet defiance. A reminder that even in a world obsessed with controlling the story, there will always be people who remember the parts they weren't supposed to. And somewhere, someone is still watching. Maybe from the shadows. Maybe from behind a desk labeled behavioral compliance. Maybe even from your own screen, waiting to see if you forget what you just saw, or if you'll be the next one to pull the thread and ask, how much of your life is truly yours? Because once you start remembering, there's no going back. And someone always notices when you do.